Hello, my friends, hello, and welcome once again to stately Vaughan Manor, where Roger and I have returned for my weekend reading report. It's time for my weekend reading report, where Roger and I talk about all the stuff that I read during the previous week, and I can talk about anything that I'm reading currently or going to read, and some of the fun stuff that's managed to make its way here to Vaughan Manor. So, the weekend reading report, let's get right to it. What did I read last week? Well, last week was crazy. It was a terrible week as far as time. I spent a lot of time doing things I had to do, and not a lot of time to do the things I wanted to do. So, I didn't get a ton of reading done. I did finish 2 books, so I'll talk about those. I didn't make many videos. You didn't see much of me last week. Sorry about that. This coming week, though, we're back to normal, I believe. I think we're going to be back to normal, so we'll see. But what did I read last week? Okay, the first book that I finished, and I talked a lot about this book the other day in a video that I did. This is Incident at 20 Mile by Trevelyan. So, in my 500 book challenge where I'm reading 500 books I already own before I'll buy any new ones, comic books, of course, are excluded. Of course. They're entirely different, let's pretend. Anyway, this is number 56. This is number 56 in my 500 book challenge. Incident at 20 Mile by Trevelyan. I did talk a lot about this the other day before I had finished it, and I mentioned that I was kind of disappointed in this book. So, this book was very kindly sent to me by Troy Tradeup. And Troy has sent me a lot of really great books, actually, and this one. So, Incident at 20 Mile. This was a Western that was written in 1998. So it's not new, but it's not as old as many of the Westerns that I read. And it was the kind of book that was trying to say a lot using the Western as a way of saying some of the things that Trevelyan wanted to say, I think, about society and the cost of violence and the history of violence in our country and the effect that it has had on us. I think he was saying things like that, I think. And so Trevelyan was using this story of the Western, using a lot of Western tropes and stereotypes. A lot of the characters were characters that we would normally see in a Western, including the main character who ends up being the marshal. But the main character of this book is actually really interesting. A lot of the characters in this book are actually really interesting characters. Trevelyan is a talented writer. He's skilled. The villain, however, was just terrible. I'm not going to accuse Trevelyan of being lazy, but it seemed like a lazy villain. I mean, he was just the typical psycho, unpredictable, crazy villain with his 2 cartoon-like henchmen. He was a cartoon as well. He talked just like Yosemite Sam, And you spend a lot of time in this book with the villain. A lot of time. So those big chunks of this book, when you had to endure the villain, it was rough going for me. Also, deliberately, Trevelyan used a very predictable, typical Western plot, which was basically the typical Western plot of outlaws coming to town, taking over the town, and they have to be defeated by the heroic marshal or some heroic character. And it happens exactly the way you would expect to happen in the plot, for the most part. The difference, like I said, was the nuance that he gives a lot of the characters. Not the villain, but a lot of the characters he makes into real characters. And so that stuff was interesting. The main character was deliberately made a damaged character. We have a guy who's very young, and he's already experienced a lot of trauma, and he's traumatized and forever damaged and changed by the violence that he experiences and the violence that he's forced to inflict. And I think Trevanian was using this character to represent, perhaps, our country and our society at the point when he was writing this book, and probably even more so now, about the history and the trauma of violence and the effects of violence. I think he was saying something along those lines. The ending of this was interesting and very well done. Very violent ending, which is always a good thing in a Western. He uses a framing device in this where Trevanian is using himself as a real person, researching an actual event and then writing a novel about it. So he's saying that this is based on a true story in the novel. Of course it isn't. And the framing device that he uses is entirely fictional, just like the rest of the story is. And is that the ice cream man? Do you want some ice cream? There's the ice cream man rolling right along, right outside the manor. How did he get on the grounds? Oh well. Anyway, where was I? Yes. A framing device. And so at the end, he uses the framing device to tell you the actual fate of the characters in this story. It's all made up, of course, but it was effective and actually touching, the ending of this story. This was a good book. It was not a really good book. It was not a great book. I think Troy believes that he saw something in this book I didn't. A lot of people did, I guess. But Troy really likes this book an awful lot. I didn't think it was that great. I think that this basically fails at what it was trying to do, but that could just be me. It could just be me. But Incident at 20 Mile, it's good. Not great. By Trevanian. Then, I talked a lot about that book. Then I read a really cool book. This was The Lone Ranger Vendetta. This is by Howard Hopkins. I'd never read a Howard Hopkins book before. And I was excited to read this because it's about the Lone Ranger. And it actually turned out to be a really exciting and entertaining book. It's really short. It's about 120 pages. But man, does Hopkins pack a lot of blood, gore, and horrific violence in 120 pages. I mean, this is a Lone Ranger novel. And the Lone Ranger, I know from the television show, it was a very rated G television show. Just as the radio show that it was based on was also just like that. And I loved the television show when I was a kid. I watched it all the time. And so when I pictured the characters when I was reading this book, I was picturing the Lone Ranger and Tonto as they were in the television show. And it's a book that is so violent and just filled with blood and gore and blood splattering everywhere and corpses piled in the corners of this book. I mean, it's just, I lost track of the bodies. It has a pretty impressive body count for a 120-page book. This book, unlike the Trevanian book, has a great villain. And the Lone Ranger and Tonto, what makes it interesting is that the Lone Ranger and Tonto are presented correctly. The Lone Ranger is like a Boy Scout, right? He's the ultimate Boy Scout cowboy hero. I mean, he never shoots to kill because that's against his code. He likes to shoot the guns out of people's hands if he can get away with it. And they're presented, as characters that could have just ridden right out of that television show and right into like a book in the Ed series of paperback westerns. It's just, it's interesting. And so the Lone Ranger seems as shocked at being in this story as I was reading it. I mean, he's like, what the hell is going on, Tonto? Why is everybody dying horrifically? This is crazy. And it was fun. It was fun to see the Lone Ranger in this situation. And it's cool that he was presented authentically. And Tonto was as well. Although Tonto, unlike in the television show, speaks perfect English. He doesn't speak the broken English that he speaks on the television show. Although he does use that as a way of fooling and putting off guard people he doesn't know. it's a fun book. It's a fun book, and it really quick, really fast paced, really enjoyable. A really enjoyable bloodbath starring the Lone Ranger. It was interesting. So that was the other book I finished. That was book number 57 in the 500 book challenge. I am now reading number 58, which is not a Western. This is The Lost Continent by Edgar Rice Burroughs. This is a small little book. I figured I'm going to squeeze this in while I have the chance. I still have a whole week left for the month. So squeezing in this book because I missed Edgar Rice Burroughs and the Edgar Rice Burroughs deep dive. And this was the next book on the list. So here it is. And I've just started it. It's really fun. I read this in my early 20s, probably late teens, early 20s, sometime around there. And I don't think I've read it since. And I'm really enjoying it. It's going to be a good one. You can tell. So The Lost Continent, I'll talk more about this after I've finished it. But a science fiction adventure that takes place in the future with a great cover, because of course Europe has just gone to hell in this book, and you know, our hero is in Britain where, you know, lions roam the streets and everybody is turned into savages or something. It's good stuff. So yeah, The Lost Continent. I'm reading that right now. I should have time to read at least one more Western for June on the Range. June on the Range, the greatest reading event ever. It's not, but if I do say so myself, June on the Range is pretty awesome. A reading event devoted to reading Westerns. I have one more Western that I really want to read, and that's The Last Ride by Robert E. Howard, the greatest pulp writer of all time. The creator of Conan. You know, if you have a paperback of Conan, you have to say by the creator of Conan on the cover. You have to. It's required. Has this great Ken Kelly cover. Good stuff. Now, I haven't read this collection of Western stories by Robert E. Howard since I first bought it in the 90s. So I'm looking forward to reading this. Yeah, and I should have time to do it. I don't know if I'll have time to read another Western for June on the Range. So this will probably close it out because July is going to be busy and I have a fairly big book to read for Roger's Cheap Old Book Club. For the July pick for Roger's Cheap Old Book Club is The Last Man by Mary Shelley. The Last Man by Mary Shelley. About a war that produces or causes or somehow is involved with a worldwide pandemic that wipes out everybody except the last man, the poor last man. So I've never read this. I've heard mixed things about it. It's a fairly long book. So it might be a challenging read if it sucks, but I can't imagine it's going to suck if Mary Shelley wrote it and she wrote Frankenstein. But we will see. There's at least going to be some interesting things about it. So that is what I'm going to be probably finishing out the month with, is starting this. I also read some comic books, so let's talk about that. Now, of course, I'm doing the World's Finest Challenge, where I have to read Superman and Batman every day of my life. I've been doing this a few months now. And this last week was actually, it was an actual challenge to fit in reading these comic books every day. I had to stay up extra late, and sometimes I had to get up extra early just so I could read Batman and Superman because I was that busy. But I don't want to fail this challenge. And so the Superman that I've been reading has been in this. This is The Man of Steel, Volume 4 of the hardcover set, which covers the time when John Byrne was on the book after he had revamped Superman. John Byrne, not the greatest comic book writer in the world, but he's an awful good artist. And there's some great artwork in here. A lot of the artwork by not only John Byrne, but also Jerry Ordway. Jerry Ordway. The Jerry Ordway art is fantastic. At this period, when I was reading Superman, The Adventures of Superman was my favorite Superman comic. There was Adventures of Superman, there was Action Comics. And Ordway did The Adventures of Superman, and he did the artwork on this book, and it was great. It was my favorite from that period. And it still holds up, I think, as the best comic book from this era of Superman. So yeah, I'm reading this right now. I did read Superman, Batman, Public Enemies. This was really good. So good, in fact, in my opinion, that I will do an Epic Comic Book Wednesday on this at some point, because I'd be interested to see what Steve Donahue thinks about it. This tells the story of Lex Luthor, who has been elected President of the United States. I know, it's unbelievable. Imagine electing a corrupt, evil, greedy businessman as president. I mean, he's a crook, an obvious one who's always telling lies that you could see right through, and he's, obviously only out for himself, but, he was elected president. It's insane. Thank goodness things like that don't happen in the real world, Roger. Anyway, yeah, this was great. I really enjoyed it. Fantastic artwork. The artwork in this was by Ed McGuinness, and Jeff Loeb did the story. It's really cool. I really enjoyed it. And so, yeah, I'll talk a lot more about this one eventually on Epic Comic Book Wednesday. So coming up, I'm going to start for Batman tomorrow. I'm going to start this tomorrow. This is Batman Hush. This is a story I've heard an awful lot about. Also written by Jeff Loeb. The artwork in here is by Jim Lee. This is by Jim Lee. And it seems like pretty good artwork. Jim Lee's pretty good. So, yeah, I'll be starting this just to see, what it's all about. I always hear about this when I hear people talk about, like, the best Batman stories. Is it one of the best Batman stories? I don't know. I haven't read it yet, but I'm going to. So there's that. Now, I did get a few things that arrived at the Manor. Some comics. Now, I didn't get any books because I can't buy any, and nobody sent me any, which is good. In fact, some people have asked me recently if they can send me some books, and for the most part, I've said, no, don't. Because I've really got enough books, and if you send me books, I don't know when I'll actually be able to read them, There's been a couple of exceptions, but for the most part, I'm like, let's put the brakes on this. So I didn't go out of my way to, like, find any free ones, at little free libraries or whatever. But I have gotten some comics. So I've got Hawkman. This is the Showcase Presents Hawkman. I finally broke down and got this because I've realized that DC is not going to put out a Silver Age omnibus, because DC's reprint program, man, I don't know. I mean, they are coming out with a Silver Age Superman, so maybe there's hope for this, for a Hawkman omnibus. But we just had a big budget DC Comics movie that had Hawkman in it, and they still didn't come out with a Hawkman omnibus. So probably not. We're probably not going to see it, unfortunately. So this might be the only way I'll get these stories for a while. So this has the original Hawkman stories by Gardner Fox as the writer. And we have Joe Kubert as the artist for most of these. Joe Kubert is one of my favorite artists. It's all in black and white, as these Showcase Presents volumes were. But still, it's really cool stuff. And this run of Hawkman comics, it's one of my favorite runs of any superhero comic ever. I just loved this comic book. So now I have it in the Showcase Presents volume. And it's probably the only way I'll have it for a while, all of those issues. Also, I got a couple of Tarzan comics. I saw a review the other day from Bob Freeman, Occult Detective, the fellow who wrote this book. This is Landon Connor's Occult Detective by Bob Freeman. There he is there. Anyway, he has a BookTube channel, and he did a review of this book. And so I had to get it. Actually, no, he did a review of this book, because there's two of them here. This one is Tarzan of the Apes by Roy Thomas and Pablo Marcos. This is volume 1. There should be a volume 2 out. And it's a daily strip, I think, that comes out from Edgar Rice Bros. Incorporated on their website. And they put it in this book, collected. I think that's what it is. I think is it daily or once I don't know. Anyway, they have a comic strip written by Roy Thomas on Edgar Rice Burroughs Incorporated's website that you can subscribe to, I think. They have a bunch of them, actually. They have a John Carter strip and everything, but I mean, hopefully they'll publish those as well. But this Tarzan one has some really cool artwork in it. It looks to be a really good adaptation of the original Tarzan novel with some of the Jungle Tales of Tarzan stories in it. This doesn't tell the entire story of the novel. It hasn't gotten that far yet in the series, I guess, by the time this was printed. But hopefully there'll be a volume 2. This is a pretty good run of comic strips. And I also got this one, Tarzan, The New Adventures. This was the one that Bob Freeman talked about in his video. And it looks great, so of course I had to get it, right? I'm a huge Edgar Rice Burroughs and Tarzan fan. The artwork looks really interesting. The artwork in this, this is also written by Roy Thomas. And it has artwork by Thomas Greinberg. And his artwork is very reminiscent. It kind of reminds me of an odd combination of John Buscema. I see a lot of John Buscema in this, with a little bit of Frank Frazetta in here as well. It's really cool artwork. I don't think he's as good as... He's not as good as Buscema or Frazetta, but still, the artwork is really good. And it looks like a really, really cool comic strip. So I was happy to get it, and I was glad to know about it. So thanks, Bob, for doing that video. Also, I got a couple of things. I got World's Finest. This is Silver Age Batman Superman World's Finest Volume 2. This has the World's Finest comics starring Batman and Superman from the late 50s. So it has a lot of science fiction shenanigans in it. You know, featuring giant monsters and other interesting stuff. Like we've got the alien Superman, very Silver Age stuff going on in this. Most of the artwork in this is by Dick Sprang, who is one of my favorite artists from this era. Dick Sprang is just really, really good, and he does most of the art in this volume, so that was cool. But the best thing I got, the very best thing I got, this might be the best thing I've picked up the whole year, and that's this. This is the best EC Stories Artisan Edition. This is magnificent. So what these artisan editions are is they'll take a comic book and they'll scan pages of the original artwork and just print them in a book. So you have like stamps and notes and other stuff going on in these books, so you can examine the artwork. I mean, this is the closest you can get to actually seeing the original pages of the artwork. Now, this is the best of EC Comics, and indeed, it has all of the stories that you would expect, like Foul Play here by Jack Davis. These are the original pages that Jack Davis drew. And the choice of stories in this volume is spot on. I mean, we have all the great stories that you would expect from EC Comics if it's a best of volume. And at the end of this, it has some science fiction stuff by Al Williamson. Just beautiful original pages reproduced here in this book. We've got Wally Wood in here, and Wally Wood's artwork, this finishes with Wally Wood, and it should, because Wally Wood was, I think everybody pretty much agrees that Wally Wood is probably the greatest artist ever from EC Comics, and this is from a company that had so many wonderful artists, but Wally Wood is really a standout. And it closes up actually with a picture of Wally Wood himself. It's beautiful. This is just a beautiful volume. So there you go. The Best of EC Stories Artisan Edition. I think that's all I have to talk about today. I've kind of gone on and on. Have to make up for all those videos I didn't do last week. Okay, guys, I will catch you next time.